Thank you for that. So we are going to just check in really quickly. And, it's that crazy time. It's spring. Things are blooming. Hopefully some things are blooming. I saw the crocus on my street a couple weeks ago, so that was really exciting. Other things are just honestly dying too. So just the onslaught of snow has not been good for some of my plants. But just wanting to think about what is something that is blooming for you all right now this spring. And so that could be in your garden, it could be professionally, it could be personally. It's any of those things. So if you could put it in the chat or unmute, however feels comfortable. Oh, Stacy, allergies. Yes, that does come with this season, sadly. Mine are also kind of flaring up. Allergies are blooming. Yeah, lots of spring events, right? Things start happening out in the community. People start gathering outside. That's super fun. Yeah, Claudia, the cherry blossoms. Those are my favorite. I love the cherry blossoms. Ooh, cool. Music programming that you've done this year and into next year. Fun. And another hurrah for cherry blossoms. Daffodils, I know, they're standing tall and proud, aren't they? I love daffodils. Awesome. Oh, what did you put in the chat, Jenny? Oh, cool. Do you have a part in this?
I co-founded it, and this is our second year doing it, and we're pretty proud of this. So I thought this is what's blooming for me, and also what keeps me going positively in my work when I see challenges.
Wonderful.
You're all invited.
Yay! Thank you. Tender weeds. Yes, literally and metaphorically. Oh, so true. I walk by those every day. Awesome. Well, thanks for checking in. Appreciate just getting a sense of how we all are thinking about spring. And it is a time to, we think about next year, but it's also important just to pay attention to the very moment, right? Because those blossoms then fall off and they're gone so quickly. So it's just a reminder for me in spring to just pay attention and pause a little bit. All right. So if we can move on to our next piece.
All right, I'm going to go through a little bit of housekeeping and just a reminder that our meetings are being recorded. So that includes anything in the chat, any documents that we've been working on, email communication about our work are all public record. Those include our agenda and meeting recordings. Those are all posted on ODE's website. And we also, provide the opportunity for people to listen in. So that's it for that one. If we go to the next one, just a reminder that we have the bike rack. If there's anything that you want to put in there, feel free. We don't currently have anything in there, so we'll move on. And then we went through the survey feedback. So at the end of each of our meeting, we asked for all of your survey feedback. What we heard is that the standards and benchmarks don't have to align exactly with CASEL. That was kind of like the big thing that kept coming up that we heard. So we wanted to provide a response to that. And we've also been noticing in some of the feedback that you all have been giving each other around not quite lining to CASEL. We just want to make sure that you all know that we've been using CASEL's competencies and the focal constructs as kind of like our guardrails to keep within the lanes for building out each of the standards and the different benchmarks. So the purpose for this has been because we didn't want to create duplication or redundancy between the standards and benchmarks. We wanted to kind of build them out just one by one. So what we think might have happened is that in our communicating around this, we probably maybe overemphasized alignment to CASEL. And we think maybe it might have come across as really having to align exactly. And that's not what we want to do. What we want to do is we want to clarify that first of all, the beauty that you all bring to this work and the expertise in creating the standards means that we should provide some flexibility. We're creating the standards and benchmarks in the framework for Oregon, not for CASEL, right? So we want to make sure that we're adapting for what Oregon needs. So there is flexibility in that. Our hope is that the standards and the benchmarks would incorporate those essential kind of parts and concepts that we've looked at that were both in the focal competence or the CASEL's competencies and focal constructs. But we also, trust the process, and we know that you'll all land on what feels right for Oregon. So we just want to make sure that you all know that there is some flexibility. So when we go to look at the benchmarks, the framework, that we'll look at that and want to just make sure that we're providing that flexibility. So I'll move on to agreements. So these are our agreements each time that we've met, and just take a look and see which ones you want to hold close today. And then if we move on to the next slide in just a moment, what I want to point to is our engaging practices. And this is going to be where we're going to spend a majority of our time today. And we're going to be looking at, again, the themes from the data. We're going to be spending quite a bit of time looking, reviewing the framework and consensus checking. So earlier, Vanessa said we're not going to be like reading really in depth. We're just going to be doing the review and then the consensus check. And so we'll break down the framework by sections. You'll see in a little bit, and then we'll give you some time in your breakout rooms for any revisions that we're going to be doing. And then if we go to the next one, Vanessa's going to take over.
All right. Yes. So we are kind of at this juncture, right, where we're very clearly can articulate and even put it on a slide, which is amazing, where we are oriented in our timeline. So just kind of want to walk through what the reality is here and what we have to work with within the bounds of this legislation and the ask of this House bill. So our goal is to have a framework and standards that is voted on April 27th, with a majority vote being 51% or over in the positive affirmation. So if we have 51% or over, then we will have, we will have met the goal of meeting our requirements and moving forward with moving it to the State Board of Education. So what that means is, as you've noticed, we've adjusted our timeline a little bit. We're meeting on April 27th. So April 27th is a big day. And just kind of want to say, so we have today, you'll have some time in your groups today, and then really the morning of April 27th to make any final changes, because on the afternoon of the 27th is when we will all take a formal vote as a whole body to see where we are. So that means hopefully we have consensus. If not, we may have to have like emergency meetings right after that to figure out what needs to be taken care of. But by May 11th, we are needing to provide to the State Board of Education the materials and all of the necessary framing, the standards, so they have time to review it, so they can ask questions and they can have some, percolating time with it to make sense of it for themselves. So we are at a very, we're at a crunch time. So just wanted to acknowledge that. And then May 11th, we had folks that reached out to say that they wanted to be part of the State Board of Education presenters. Sorry. So Allie, Christina, Ricky, and Jenny all wanted to be part of that. If you would like to be part of that, there's still space for that, because we will have 2 presentations to the State Board of Education. So what will happen is, if you want to be a part of that, let me know. And then we will invite you to this May 11th meeting. And that's where we'll kind of look at our presentation, review the docket that gets shared with the State Board of Education, and get you all prepared to share what you all have developed over the course of a couple months. So that will happen May 11th. May 18th is when the group will go to the State Board of Education, and you do not have to go to Salem in person. So there is the option of joining in virtually. And so that May 18th is a really clear deadline. That is when the public will have first access to the framework and the standards be made available. So that will go public. Folks that are a part of this group will share that information. And then what happens is there's a period of public comment. So right after May 18th, State Board of Education gets feedback about what has been put out forward for the SEL standards. So we expect that we'll get more feedback, and then we will meet again in June, early June, for our last meeting. And that will only be a half a day meeting. And in that meeting, you all will be given this feedback from public comment, and you'll decide what you want to incorporate or not. And then take a final vote, and then share it with the state board on June 15th. So our hope is that on that June 15th, they can either be adopted, or the state board can decide to take some time to review it a bit more. But our absolute deadline will be in September. So basically, we all will be done as a group after June 15th. So that's kind of the commitment of the group and what it's looking like for us. Just to note, you'll see on June 8th, so we were supposed to meet on June 8th. However, we have to provide the materials to the state board before that on June 5th. So we cannot have a meeting after the fact that we are sharing with the board what you all have decided to make changes or not make any changes. So that means we're looking at June 1st instead. So we will be creating a Google form just to hear from you if that's a possibility. We need to have a quorum, which is half of the group be present to vote on that day. So what we'll be asking is how many of you on June 1st can attend to make the final decision and take the final vote before our last read to the state board. So any questions about that? Because I know it's convoluted. There's a lot of moving pieces with all of these elements. Okay. So just to reiterate, really April 27th, anything that we want to have incorporated into the framework and into the standards will need to be done and finalized by April 27th. So that's kind of like our big deadline. So that's in 2 weeks, 2 weeks time. All right. And then, yeah, just our meeting outcomes for today. We have 2 of them. There they are. The first one is we're going to do a consensus check on Oregon's transformative SEL framework. So that's everything that happens before we actually get to the standards themselves. So we just want to check in and see where we are. We're going to provide our voice in the form of written feedback so that feedback can be used by groups to make changes as needed. So that will happen today, just like we did last month. And then the last part will be to give you all time in your groups to really take a deeper dive into the data that we have available. And those folks that were with us in the morning, we had a really good and very deep conversation. So they will hopefully kind of get you up to speed and share a little bit about what was talked about, what was surfaced. But that's really a time for you all internally to check in and see what you want to do with this data and what you want to act on. All right. So I will pass it to Beth, who's going to share a little bit about our data.
Thanks, Vanessa. Sharon, if you want to go to the next slide. So this morning we talked a bit about the engagement feedback. Some of this is going to be a review. For those that weren't here, we had covered this morning, so I'm going to run through just a little bit quicker, but you do have access to the PowerPoint if you wanted to review a little bit more. But just wanted to highlight high level that there was a really good turnout for our student engagement sessions. We had the 2 of them. And there was approximately 30 students that came to both. We also met with student success groups. They were actually the people that are connected to student success groups, but not actually on there. And we had a turnout of 6. So we did get some really good feedback and they were super engaged, although there wasn't the best turnout for those, but it was still great to talk with them. And then we have the statewide survey. We received 590 responses, which is really great for ODE response rate. And that ended up giving us a lot of data. So we've been able to bring in some expertise to help us with data analysis on that. You got to meet them earlier this morning. They won't be able to join us this afternoon, but just lovely colleagues that have been working with us. And then also on the slide, you can see is the survey responses if you want access to the raw data. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. That data was all sent to you in advance as well if you wanted to have time to review it. And then we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide. So just some overarching themes from the student youth groups. We talked about this morning that we were asked to not give them the standards to respond to, but rather ask them some questions to kind of get at what their experiences with SEL were. And then what we were able to do is kind of synthesize that into some themes. So you see the questions there, and then underneath are the themes. The bullets are the themes that came up for each question. So you see question 1 and the responses, the themes.
Can you open?
Yes, I can. You see question 2 and the responses. And then if we go on to the next slide, you'll see question.
Mom, doing a pocket.
So sorry.
Mom,
You'll see question 3 and 4. And then what those, the themes were bulleted underneath. Great. And then for the, go ahead and go on to the next one. And then for student success plans, you can see here that what we did. So for just real quick, what we did for them is we asked to provide warm and cool feedback on each of the different standards, as well as the framework. And then we asked them to provide implementation considerations. So overall, the feedback was warm. They thought it was very helpful and needed. And then here are some of the other themes below that bulleted that you can see that came out of that. And some of them were ideas of what's needed. And so we wanted to highlight what kept coming up. And then I will hand it over to Vanessa.
Okay, so we're now pivoting from the students and the listening sessions that we hosted to the survey, which was kind of really shared very broadly. So just really appreciate all of you in distributing that and getting it into the hands of teachers, which was really important to us to hear from them. So thank you for your part in making sure we hear from folks. So just again, really broad, I'm just going high level. That's why there's a bird there, just to remind us that we're looking at big picture. But as you get into your groups this afternoon, you'll have access to a lot more like mouse data. So like very right in front of you, very detailed, specific, relating to your standard. We have kind of figured out some themes and then some quotes that we wanted to really elevate for you all to really consider, because sifting through 200 responses for each of the standards was a lot. So we're trying to reduce that load for you all. So really kind of thinking and picking up on some general themes, as well as some like really specific things that you may want to look at and talk through together as a team. So here we are. We did have representation from, mostly Portland area. So just acknowledging that, although we did have pretty good representation from Southern Oregon and even the coast, which was great. So just a sense of where we're hearing from people in terms of our responses. And then in our next slide, the different roles that really participated in the survey. So, I mean, there was another column where folks could say what they were doing and what role capacity they have. Those are not included. So these are just the highest response rates came from these groups. So we did hear very loudly from our counselors. They're the 19%, so very well represented there. And then also really heard from K-5 teachers and 9 through 12 teachers. So that was kind of the highest capture rate in terms of teacher input. And then you can see, you all have access to this data, so you can break it down and go further if that feels right for your group. And then our next slide is our just representation by race and ethnicity. So who responded to the survey. And so just want to name and acknowledge that we had a large portion. So 81% of participation in the survey were from folks that identified as white. So just all of these things are things to consider as you decide and make changes or don't make changes, to consider all of these pieces in your conversation as you continue to revise your standards and the framework. And then this one's for our LGBTQ2SIA plus population. So just folks that identified with that. We had about 11% that responses did identify as part of that community, and 78% that did not. So that's a little bit about our demographics. And then let's just drill down to the standards. So we did ask, I hope you all got a chance to look at the survey, but there was a quantitative component where they had to rank themselves on a Likert scale, and then a qualitative component where they could open-ended response, give feedback. So in terms of clarity is what you see on the left-hand side. So 1 being on the left is strongly disagree, and then a 4 being strongly agree. So just generally the pattern across all the standards, every one of them, was that the majority were in the yes, this is clear category, so 3 and 4, as well as the implementation. So the implementation question is, do you see yourself using and embodying the standard in your classroom with students, or in whatever role you are in the school building or in the district? So again, overall, folks did see themselves in the 3-4 category. So they did see themselves as being able to implement these standards. So that's just kind of like current level, what we have so far. Standard 2 is our next slide. So just following along with the same pattern. So, right, most of our responses were in the positive, warm, yes, we're in the right direction. And then for standard 3, the same. Standard 4, the same. And standard 5, the same. So just looking at it holistically, right, we can get some good information from that piece that we're trending in the right direction. We had more folks feeling good about both how clear they are and also ease of implementing them in their practice. And then slide 50, this one shows, we asked a question about what would help implement these standards. So again, you all are not in charge of implementation of these standards, right? But we wanted to surface and hear from people about what would be helpful in terms of ODE and our work with ESDs and district folks. What do we need to start really thinking about to support these standards? So what really came out was that folks wanted indicators for each of the standard. That was something that those that responded, 45% wanted that. 42% really also looked at professional learning. So that's going to be a key piece of how this gets rolled out. So really thinking about what does that look like? So those are the kinds of things we're going to have to be paying attention to. And then another big one was also, yes, time to collaborate with teachers. So making sure that there's structures and place and time for folks to come together and make sense of them and think about how they can support each other with this implementation. So thinking a lot about what structures already exist in schools and in districts to help facilitate conversations around these standards. All right. And then our last slide just shares just some overall themes, like what we noticed. So Beth, myself, and we had 2 psychometricians, which was a new word for me in my lexicon. And so the 4 of us looked at all the responses. So we had, we had time to do that. And so we're just elevating some things that were consistent across all of the standards. So while you all are working in your teams, there were some unifying pieces. So one of those was that there are too many concepts in each benchmark. So really trying to think about not trying to cram too much in a benchmark, but maybe considering, do they need to be split up to be discrete or separate benchmarks? Because it felt like there were too many things happening at one time for each of these benchmarks. So I would look through the lens when you meet with your groups to kind of pay attention to that. The other part was simplifying language. So there was a lot of, I don't know if discomfort is the right word, or just a lot of questions about like, well, what is social analysis? What is identity affirming? Just a lot of wonderings about what these words and terms mean. And so I think that's just very helpful information for us in terms of professional learning. What do we need to do to really explain that? And then what can we do in the framework to help really define some of those pieces? And then also what can we do in the standards? Like, does that impact what you choose to keep or not keep? So all of those things are just things you all will have to wrestle with. And then there was a question about appropriateness for younger students. So did hear a little bit about, oh, this feels like this is more for high school, middle school. So just acknowledging that that was a perspective that was kind of surfaced again and again. And then concerns for implications of the standards. So that really means we did have responses that very clearly did not see a space or a place for SEL to be in schools. So we had that on one end. And on another end, we had folks that were saying it's about time. So we had everything in between, but just want to name that it's seen as political. So just naming that that's out there. And you will probably see that if you look through the raw data, you'll start to sense some of those trends. And then concern for measuring of the standards. So a lot of concerns about, am I supposed to measure the standards? Am I supposed to assess students? Am I supposed to grade students on this? Other folks had concerns about adults, that adults don't embody these yet themselves. So what is the implication of that and how they decide this for students? So just a lot there around measurement that just kept coming up as a real worry. And then same thing with curriculum. So some folks were like, well, this is fine, but I want the curriculum. Other folks were like, how is this going to work within my content area? If I'm already teaching this, is it going to be aligned? What are the curriculums that align to this? And so, I just want to pause and say that, and I hope you as you read through the framework, that you got a sense that transformative SEL is really about moving away from that. So it's moving away from curriculum, standalone lessons, and just a way of how we show up in community with each other, with our students. So it's a lot more about the pedagogical practices and the environments that we help shape and how we invite students to partner with us and families to partner with us in that venture. So just some concerns that kept coming up in many of the responses. Okay, so just want to take a moment to pause. And either in the chat or unmute, is there something you want to elevate that you saw that you want to reinforce, or something you want to question? What's coming up for you all?
I'd be super curious to see for the votes on the survey that are 1 and 2, how many of those are regional, especially given that some of the findings were regarding like how politicized the topic is, and seeing getting more detailed feedback from those particular regions, if there's a correlation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, we just didn't have time because it ended on the 7th and we had this meeting. So we couldn't do all of the data manipulation we wanted to or hoped to do. But you will, you know, as you look through the raw data, you do get a sense of like where those comments tend to come from. So yes, important to really question and think through those pieces, like who are we hearing from here? What's coming up? And it also helps us too, because these are going to be implemented across the state. Like what we need to do and how we can support communities differently is going to be just ongoing conversation. Yeah, thanks for surfacing that. Anything else? So I'm just going to say it was a lot. So if you all are feeling overwhelmed, we've had time to sit with the data and return to it again and again. And so just acknowledging that it can have a lot of, you will notice that you'll have feelings and responses as you see things, right? Because we all really care and deeply value this work, and that's just not reflected in some of the responses. So just wanting to say that. So give yourself some spaciousness and time, and it's a worthy exercise to really go back to. I've been going back every day, and every day I see something a little bit different. So there's just a lot there. Okay, so we're going to take a hard pivot. So I'm just going to make that shift here for us. So we have all this data. We're going to be spending time more in our groups, kind of looking at it and how it pertains to each of our standards. So you'll see that we've isolated a lot of this for each of your specific work groups so that you can really process this together. But right now we're going to focus on our framework. So there's just, and I just want to say and appreciate all the folks that have been part of the framework. It's been a heavy lift for them, I think, in some ways, because they had a lot that was there from the last group and also making sense of it for this group, and the audience is different, right? So they've just had a lot to consider, and it's a lot of the actual writing. So, oh, Stacy, yes, sincere applause, absolutely. So if we can just like give them some sort of visual acknowledgement, whether it's raise the roof or claps. They've met behind the scenes, they've read through the comments, they've added pieces. So just continuous work to really get it to its current shape. So really tremendous gratitude for all of them. All right, so let's talk about our framework. If we can go to the next slide, we're going to spend a large time, well, about an hour, really kind of in our own space, thinking through it. You've all had a chance to read it beforehand. And this is really the time now to just get a sense of what is working and what is still needs a little help in terms of bringing it to a final draft on April 27th. So to kind of orient us into all of these pieces, and this has been, Allie's going to laugh at me, but it's been a lot of like back and forth and just like adapting and figuring it out together and alongside each other. And what is a framework? How's it different than standards? How's it different than implementation? Like all of these things are really complex and they're connected, but they are also different. So just a lot to sift through. So the way we looked at this was that really our why, like why do we have these standards? What does our data tell us? What are students telling us is in that preliminary report that the phase 1 wrote. They looked at all of the different standards across the nation. They've looked at what is really important, what to center in our framework. And so that's really kind of like the blueprint and like why we're doing what we're doing. Then there's like the how. So how are we going to actually embody all of this? And so that's the implementation guidance. That's all of the stuff that you don't have to take all of this on. These are things that we're going to do outside and that are not going to live in this one document. There will be many documents. There will be many resources that accompany this framework and these standards. So our job is to figure out what is the best place for some of these things to live. So in terms of implementation, we're thinking about, yes, indicators, professional learning, crosswalks with other standards, thinking about toolkits that maybe we're thinking about having another group of folks come together to create a toolkit that provides resources, links, things to like really take and grab and look at to support districts in their work. And then alignment to other ODE initiatives. Where can we start making some connections and joining some dots so that it doesn't feel like it's this other thing, but that's connected to a bigger systemic shift. So that's all the how, and we don't have to answer all these things. The what is the framework. So the framework is stable. That means it's not, we can't add things that are going to change, because this framework is just helping folks understand and literally frame the standards that follow. So it does not have to include everything. It just has to provide information about what would be important to think about in terms of and in relationship to these standards. And then as the phase 1 did, and as phase 2 has continued on, what are the components and conditions that we would want to pay attention to as part of the framework? So what you see on the left are all the changes that have been made since draft 5. And what our approach has been is to really take out the things like at one point we had, oh, professional learning, all of these different things need to be talked about in professional learning. And it's like, okay, but we don't know yet, right? Like we don't even know what the standards are going to look like. They're not stable yet. So we're holding off on some of those pieces for implementation down the road. So some things have moved and shifted where we didn't want to be redundant as well. So just kind of paying attention to, hey, we already said this up here. Do we need it twice? You know, so just made some decisions. Everything that was in draft 5 is here also in draft 6. It's just potentially in a different location. And then on the right-hand side are the things that we know are still outstanding. So we do need to spend time with formatting, editing. We know that we'll have our comms team look at this more carefully so that there's a consistent voice. There are just some things that we need to finalize, but we want to first, that's why our consensus check is really important. Like, do we have some of the foundational content pieces in place so that we can start moving more towards editing and some of those end of the writing cycle process. So I'm going to pause here too. Any questions, thoughts, initial ideas, reactions to what you all saw in the framework?
Well, I will just start out and say that's a tremendous amount of work and organization of said writing work. And I'm very appreciative of it. I think it is better aligned, this draft that I read through. I absolutely love the graphic that was designed. I really like it, and I love the consistency of using it with different color palettes to indicate different areas. That was a great move.
Yeah. And I'll just, again, just share my appreciation for the team. It's been amazing to work with them. And I think we feel like there's more to ground ourselves in what transformative SEL means. So I think and hope that that will resonate as folks open this up, that this kind of helps introduce and lay the groundwork for what follows. So thank you all.
And I wanted to say I really appreciate the inclusion of community responsiveness into the framework and the focus on not just having one perspective or one point of view, because I think when it comes to different regions of the state, because different communities may not, or ethnic groups or groups may not necessarily be as represented, it's kind of used as an excuse to not necessarily touch on those areas rather than actually calling for a higher need for that, right? So I really, really appreciate how community responsiveness was framed.
All right. Well, thank you all. So we're gonna go ahead and just dive in. So I think the best way to do this is to all be looking at the same draft for starters. So I'm going to put it in the chat. There's the draft you should have open, draft 6. And then let me find my decision points here. And then here's our decision tool.
Vanessa, if it's okay, I'm just going to mention that we have quorum right now with 14 members present. If
Perfect.
anything pops off, then we won't have quorum for any consensus. So I just wanted to mention that now.
Yes. So if you find yourself that you might be someone that needs to leave, then please move ahead. We have provided 10 minutes for each section. But yes, we want to make sure we get that so that we can move forward. So we would appreciate if you're able to stay and at least let us know your score for each of the areas. Okay, so I also popped in the decision-making tool, so that's where we're going to capture all of our thoughts. Yes, everyone is participating in this. So every person is participating in this. So even if you're on the framework group, your voice matters. Absolutely. And we're going to spend 10 minutes for each different section. And so again, the way that we're honoring all voices and we're taking it in the form of written feedback, and that's so that we can operationalize this and make sense of it as we move into groups so that we know what is outstanding and who we might need to connect with, right? So if someone has an issue with something, we can reach out and invite that person into our group this afternoon and just make sure that their voice is incorporated and their feedback is part of this process. All right, we ready? Roll up those sleeves. Here we go. So we're going to focus on the first section, which is all of the framework elements starting on page 3. I just want to make sure that's correct. Yes, so starting on page 3 all the way through 10. Is that right? Yes, so all the way up to the component 1, the guiding principles. So we're going to take it all the way up through 9, up to the guiding principles. Okay, and then Sharon's going to be our timekeeper. So she'll let us know when we're at start. And then we'll give you a 2-minute warning, maybe at the 8-minute mark. And so what we're doing is we're writing our name. We're checking in on consensus where we are. If you are at a below 2 or below, you do need to provide like a suggested change that would need to happen so that the group knows what to revise. And then we'll take a count and then move on to the next section. So any questions before we get going?
The,
Jenny.
the format of that right now is in comment mode only, so typing in the table is coming.
Oh, that's not good. Okay, let's change that to editors. Thank you for catching that. Okay, you should be able to refresh at this time. Okay, perfect. I see you all are writing your names. Awesome. All right, Sharon, so you can clock us away.